I think this is quite very timely, and the gap report for adaptation in the African continent is pretty much defined by the emission gap. The findings are that the higher the emissions, the gap for adaptation for Africa will also be higher, and therefore needs more cost to close that gap. But currently, the report findings shows that with the current situation at the moment, the current emissions in the atmosphere, the continent needs 7 to 15 billion to close that gap. And there is potential that will hit 2 degrees if the current pledges that are put in place are not changed, or if the ambition is not increased. And if we hit 2 degrees, the report findings shows that we will need 35 billion to close the gap between now and 2040, and 200 billion to close the gap by 2070. But the findings also showcase that the issues around climate change impacts are going to be exacerbated. Sea level rise is going to increase up to about 1 meter, which is 10% of the entire global mean, meaning that most of the African cities located at the coastline, and with about 32 countries in the entire continent being coastal countries, assets, maritime action will be disrupted, spiraling economic damages that could put a lot of people out of jobs and at the same time exacerbate poverty. So the report findings showcases some bleak pictures for the continent, and at the same time provide solutions on how this could be resolved.
Okay, and just sort of briefly, what are the big figures then? What do these governments need in order to be able to adapt?
Well, the big figures are only with the current situation and with the current pathway in which emissions are increasing in the atmosphere. Adaptation financing for the continent have got to increase by 10% every year up to 2020. So governments have got to ensure that funding for adaptation is put in place, because adaptation, the gap has got to be closed. So if the gap is not closed, the predictions like sea level rise, disrupting activities in so many cities in the continent, crop failure up to about 20%, plunging a lot of people into hunger, malnutrition in West Africa projected to reach 25%, malnutrition in East Africa projected to reach 85%, and malnutrition in Southern Africa projected to reach 95%. All these will cause stuntedness in kids and impair cognitive ability. Amongst others, the rainfall patterns in the continent are going to change, reducing up to about 20% in Southern Africa and up to about 40% in Western Africa. So all these findings from the report are like an urgent call, and therefore funding to close this gap and also to eliminate emissions by 2 degrees is quite fundamental. Another bleak findings from the report, which are quite very resounding reminder of what is ahead, is that the GDP of the continent could be affected by up to 7%, spiraling all the economic gains that have been achieved up to date, reversing those gains, and somehow also reversing the Millennium Development Goals that have been achieved in some parts of the continent.